start our recording, start our share screen. All righty. Got to get my participants up here. Still not 100% used to using all these monitors in this framework, but we'll get there. Okay. So welcome everyone. We are going to talk today about the way that Heschel saw human beings specifically, and what it is that it's our job to do in this world. So I titled it People and Action. I will share that Heschel was writing in a different time, and therefore he uses the term man to mean human beings. I'm taking you exactly the quotes from these books in terms of the way that it is. So just be aware of that as we go through. But when he refers to man, obviously he's referring to humankind, to human beings, in general. So we're going to start by sort of looking at a couple of overarching themes and then really focus into what it is that our job as human beings is to do. So let's begin. In God in Search of Man, Heschel writes, there is a high cost of living to be paid by a Jew. He has to be exalted in order to be normal in a world that is neither propitious nor sympathetic to his survival. Some of us, tired of sacrifice and exertion, often wonder, is Jewish existence worth the price? Others are overcome with panic. They're perplexed and despair of recovery. In trying to understand Jewish existence, a Jewish philosopher must look for agreement with the men of Sinai as well as the people of Auschwitz. And I picked this for two different reasons. One, I think it's a great way to start talking about how Heschel sees human beings, but we had a little bit of a conversation in both of the last two sessions on how does Heschel deal with the Holocaust. And this is one of the most clear indications of how he sees philosophy, or a Jewish philosophy. At some point in time, it needs to be a conversation, and he goes so far as to say agreement. We have to come to terms with those people who were standing at Sinai. And if you think about just that image of standing at Sinai, it's the moment of closest connection to God. It's the moment pregnant with the most possibility of Jewish future and what Jewish history is to become. And with those people who were at Auschwitz, who represent, for many philosophers, one of the farthest moments of distance from God and hopelessness and questioning of the survival of Judaism. At some point in time, there needs to be some common language that we use. He lived in the 20th century, and this is reflective of a philosopher of the 20th century. It sounds like that, right? Is Jewish existence worth the price? We still ask these same questions today. Saul said pretty nihilistic. Yeah, I mean, if this were his only source by itself, I would agree with that, Saul, that this is nihilism at its best. But because it's in a context of a larger conversation, he wasn't a nihilist. He wasn't whatever it's going to be, que sera, sera type of thing. But this definitely has that feeling. Any other questions or comments on this particular source to begin us off? All right. From Who is Man, we get this source. What do I see when I see a man? I see him first as one other specimen of the human species, and then as a specific particular individual, who can be named or identified. But then he stands before me as the only entity in nature with which sanctity is associated. All other sacred objects in space are made holy by man. Human life is the only type of being we consider intrinsically sacred, the only type of being we regard as supremely valuable. Now, maybe that's a conceit on our part, since it's we human beings that are saying that. Maybe the dolphins have something different to say. I don't know. But this is coming from Heschel in the 20th century. The particular individual may not be dear to me. In fact, I may even dislike him. But he is dear to someone else, to his mother, for example, although that too is not the reason for his eminence. For even if nobody cares for him, he still is a human being. So what is he saying here? He's saying that being human has intrinsic value. Intrinsic value. And he talks about it in two different ways. He talks about it as intrinsic value just by being human, but he focuses that in saying it has to do with the fact that we are holy and we can make things holy. That's going to be very important for Heschel, and it's going to be very important as we translate who we are into what we're supposed to do in this world, right? If our intrinsic value is due to the fact that we can make things holy, then we better be doing that. Otherwise, we're not living up to our value. We're not living up to what it is that we're supposed to be doing. Marcia or David? I'm not sure who's asking the question. But you need to unmute yourself first. There you go.
Hi, I'm just looking at that quote. It reminded me of exactly what they were saying about the Chauvin verdict today.
Tell me.
Basically that they were saying that George Floyd was cared for by the community, by his family, but that's not the reason for his importance, or as Heschel put, his eminence. Or even if nobody cared for him, it's important because George Floyd was still a human being.
Yeah.
And
That's right.
It struck me that it's exactly the same quote.
Yes, it is. Okay, any other comments on this? Okay, again? Or were you lowering your hands? Oh, again, go ahead. Oh, you're just lowering it. Okay. All right, couple more. We got two little short sources that I'll put together on this. From Who is Man? Man is a messenger who forgot the message. I love this. This was I spent an hour just thinking about the ramifications of this particular quote. Man is a messenger who forgot the message, right? God put us on this earth to do something. God put us on this earth to give a message, right? To bring God into this world, I think Heschel would argue. And yet somehow we've forgotten the message. And the other quote, small quote that I decided to put together with this: the great problem in the life of man is whether to trust, to have faith in God. The great problem in the life of God is whether to trust, to have faith in man. Heschel was really about relationship. You know, when we talk about Jewish philosophy and relationship with God, we usually think about Buber, right? I, thou, that's all about the relationship. But Heschel actually is all about relationship. That's what his focus is. And he reminds us that it goes both ways. That's why he has those two books, right? Man is not alone, Man in Search of God, God in Search of Man, I mean. So it's both of these together actually create a wonderful little philosophical insight into how Heschel views human beings and what our role is and what our job is. Peter.
It is extremely difficult to be in a covenantal relationship with God, to be in this covenant. It challenges us every day, and
Yeah.
that
Nobody ever said
challenge
it was going to be easy.
is very hard. It's very hard being Jewish. When I was in college, and this is in the mid 70s, there were people who had never seen someone Jewish before, or Italian or Catholic, and they wanted to know where your horns are. It's very, very difficult to be a Jew in the world today, and we're doing ourselves in through intermarriage and everything else today. We're not. I don't know if that covenant, which is supposed to be generation to generation, is really being passed well, and whether we're doing our job. And I think Heschel is saying that.
Yeah. Diana has a question, and then I'll respond to Saul's direct message question. So Diana first.
Actually, it's very interesting because it just happens to be that I captioned a program today on covenantal relationships as a tribute, I guess, towards the legacy of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, which is one way that I was saying that that I was seeing these similarities with the covenantal. But I think Heschel he just makes it so difficult. Like it's like I can see, like, someone, you had mentioned a lot of the Hasidus and what he's saying about man is the messenger. Well, that's why, like, Chabad has shluchim. They're actually like lishloach. They are messengers. They're being out there to send the message. So it's like, okay, yeah, like maybe the Rebbe saw that like man is a messenger who forgot the message, but I feel like he was a lot more. I can speak to Chabad because I'm, involved too, but just a lot more proactive, where I think there's just so much doom and gloom here. And I can understand why. I mean, it was pretty gloomy times for him, but he didn't come from Europe and just really take that Hasidus to it. He took it to a very, I think, academic level. And I don't see that he had the same reach with this exact message, that maybe could have done a little bit more to promulgate a more uplifting Judaism within that scope of academia as well.
So yeah, he definitely was living in an academic world. The other thing that I'll say to you is, we're going to see, we know from other classes that we've taken, that Heschel was very involved in social action. One of the questions that Saul Kempinski has asked me offline a number of different times is, his life wasn't always so easy at the seminary and the schools, because he wanted to rock the boat. He wanted to get out there. He wanted people to do things. And we're going to see that in his later text of, it's not about the thought, it's about the deed. And the fact that people weren't doing it, I think, to me, that was some of his doom and gloom. It's like, wait, we're not doing we're forgetting what we're supposed to be doing. And so I think that may be part of it. So I asked a different question: is the messenger only a Jew? I think Heschel would say no, and we're actually going to have a source that deals with some of the comparisons about that. So that may speak to it a little bit, Saul. I would say Heschel would say no, but it is a uniquely Jewish job in the way that God has created this covenant with us to be a messenger. It doesn't exclude other people as well, but it is our job, is how I would answer that. Okay, let's move on. From a book called The Insecurity of Freedom. This is the first time we've actually seen this book. It's not as well of a known work in terms of what Heschel has done in comparison to some of these others that we've seen. There are two ways in which the Bible speaks of the creation of man. In the first chapter, the book of Genesis, which is devoted to the creation of the physical universe, matter is described as having been created. Man is described, I was dictating and it changed it. Man is described as having been created in the image and likeness of God. In the second chapter, which tells us of the commandment not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, man is described as having been formed out of the dust of the earth. Together, image and dust express the polarity of the nature of man. And this is actually a very important part of the way that Heschel saw human beings, as being between these two poles, right? We are in the image of God, and we are dust, and we are both at the same time. And that's not an easy thing to try and comprehend, and yet that's who we are. Now, we've heard this before, and there's definitely, there's Hasidic stories about, forgetting actually the name of the rabbi, and I should remember it. If somebody remembers, you can tell me, who had the two pieces of paper inside of his pockets, right? And when he felt like the world was his oyster, it said, from dust you were created, to dust you will return. When he felt like nothing is going right from him, he read the verse that says, for you the world was created. And that's kind of what this is saying. It's picking up on that same idea, is that neither by itself is true. Both are true. Both are necessary. And so he picks up on this, in a couple of different places, but Simcha Bunim, yeah. No, that's the name of the author, I think. Is that the name of the person who wrote it? It may be.
That's what it says, Simcha Bunim Bonhart.
Okay, got it. Okay, so he picks up on this in a couple of different places, but he really digs into it in Insecurity of Freedom. So I'm actually going to bring you the next section of it, which continues. Our existence, I'm sorry, no, this is from Man is Not Alone. I just didn't bring it up. That's what I thought. It was from a different place. From Man is Not Alone. Our existence seesaws between animality and divinity. And I don't think animality is actually a word, but Heschel liked making up words. Between that which is more and that which is less than humanity. Below is evanescence, futility, and above is the open door of the divine exchequer, where we lay up the sterling coin of piety and spirit, the immortal remains of our dying lives. This is Heschel at his best in terms of the words that he uses. This is why people say he's so difficult, right? He tries to paint these images with words we just don't normally use in our everyday lives. But this polarity between animal and God is similar to what he was saying in the Insecurity of Freedom between dust and the image of God, right? The physical and the spiritual. Those are pulling us in different directions. And we need to exist in both of them. And Peter said correctly, simultaneously, right? It's not, you don't go back and forth between them. And yes, this brings from Hasidic tradition, Diana, the idea of an animal soul and a spiritual soul, right? The physical side and the spiritual side. Absolutely, he's getting it. All right. Any questions on this before we move on? All right. So this is sort of my transitional, one of my transitional texts into thinking about what it is that we should do. This is from Man's Quest for God. There is a divine dream. By the way, the hubris to say what the divine dream is, that's a different question, right? Who are we to say what the divine dream is? There's a divine dream, which the prophets and rabbis have cherished, and which fills our prayers and permeates the acts of true piety. It is a dream of a world rid of evil by the grace of God, as well as by the efforts of man, by his dedication to the task of establishing the kinship of God. I think it should be kingship, but it said kinship. That's what I brought out of the text that I had, of God in the world. God is waiting for us to redeem the world. We should not spend our lives hunting for trivial satisfaction while God is waiting. I personally find this to be a moving text. Those last two lines are very powerful, right? God's waiting for us to do what we're supposed to do. And here we are spending our time with all these trivialities, with these things that don't really matter, and ignoring the very things that do matter. And we see this as something that clearly is going to inform not only his general philosophy, but then his philosophy and theology of social action and why he was out there marching with Martin Luther King and those sorts of things as well. So the Cullys first, then Michael Frank.
Hopefully I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
In that respect, I don't know how many of you saw the Jewish Film Festival in February. The opening film was entitled Shared Legacies, and I encourage everyone to see this because it had Heschel in his own voice stating what we as Jews, our obligations is to the civil rights movement. And it was very, very moving, and also touched on his relationship with Martin Luther King, and also had his daughter talk about him as well. So I encourage everyone to see that if they can.
Yeah, I agree. I saw that movie and it was very, very good. Debbie and I was the first one that we saw in the film festival. So yeah, I agree. Thank you, Sophia. Michael.
In the book God in Search of Man, I'm riffing off of God is waiting for us to redeem the world. Heschel makes the point, and I thought this was extremely powerful, that God has never lost faith in man and has infinite patience to wait. I find that wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it's, Heschel and God in Search of Man, which our next source is actually from God in Search of Man. But in that book, right, Heschel is trying to describe the other half of the relationship, right? Here we are trying to have a relationship. How do we have a relationship with this infinite, amorphous, non-seeable, whatever? And these are the things that Heschel is saying to try and help us understand how we can actually have this relationship, even in spite of all of the challenges that we have. Good. Thank you, Michael. Diana.
So I think part of what's missing for me is like, he's going from A to C, and he's, instead of going like from A to B to C, and it's just all so cerebral and philosophical, and it's
what would B be here for you?
A B would be an action that more people could take. Like, not everybody could. It's amazing what he did for civil rights, absolutely amazing. But that's just not something everybody could be doing, was going out and marching with Dr. Martin Luther King. Like, this is pretty, like,
he thought so. He thought so. And that was part of the issue. He thought,
yeah,
of course everyone could. But
everybody could light Shabbat candles and have that spark. And obviously this is coming from a little bit of a Hasidic bias, but I just think he's missing a little bit of the philosophy part. Brilliant, but he's missing a little bit of the how-to and really bringing it to the people in a more attainable way, not dumbing it down necessarily, but where would be a good starting point be? It's just really lofty.
Yeah,
I think.
So look, there is a
that's reason, what I mean from the A to C instead of the A to B to C.
There is a reason that Heschel and Kaplan, were not congregational rabbis. Right? There's a reason, because you're right. They didn't speak in terms of, one of the big challenges that you get. It's interesting. We had that a little bit with some of our rabbinic interns that we had over the last couple of years, right? That rabbis come out of rabbinical school thinking, oh, we're going to be able to talk all these things and everyone's going to come and follow me. And the reality is most people aren't in that place. And you need to first start where people are and then move them, right, to this. I would venture to say, I don't have to venture to say it, I'm looking around this Zoom room and every single person here has had some additional Jewish learning. This is not your first class, right? And first you have to have some additional Jewish learning, and then we can sit down and now have a real good conversation about Heschel. And I think that's kind of, Dana, what you're saying. Rivka. Nope,
You're
just
muted.
Okay.
There you go.
I don't hear in this particular section that he is calling everybody to walk the civil rights march. I hear him saying that everybody is responsible to redeem the world. And there are a multitude of ways to redeem the world. One is by marching. One is by befriending. One is becoming more educated. I
I
mean,
would
there's
agree with that.
so I don't hear him calling everybody to do the exact same thing he did.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean,
Okay.
this is what I was saying is this is the philosophy that led him to go out and march,
Right. Yes.
right?
And yes, which could lead us to go out and do something else to
Right.
redeem the world, to do our
I
part.
agree. I agree. No, I agree with what you're saying. Okay, so now, so as I said, this is the transitional text. Let's now kind of move into more of the action text. Like, what is our job? What are we supposed to be doing in this world? So in God in Search of Man, 283 to 284, we have this text. And it's actually kind of a long text, so it's on 2 different slides. How should man, being created in the likeness of God, live? So we have established the image part. Now, how should we live? What way of living is compatible with the grandeur and mystery of life? It is a problem which man has always been anxious to ignore. Upon the pavement of the Roman city of Timgat, the inscription was found which reads, to hunt, to bathe, to gamble, to laugh, that is to live. Judaism is a reminder of the grandeur and earnestness of living. In what dimension of existence does man become aware of the grandeur and earnestness of living? So here's his answer. It is in deeds that man becomes aware of what his life really is, of his power to harm and to hurt, to wreck and to ruin, of his ability to derive joy and bestow it on others, to relieve and to increase his own and other people's tensions. It is in the employment of his will, not in reflection. So I'm going to emphasize that differently. It is in the employment of his will, not in reflection, that he meets his own self as it is, not as he should like it to be. In his deeds of men, exposing, it is the deeds of men that exposes his imminent as well as his suppressed desires, spelling even that which he cannot apprehend. He may not dare to think, what he may not dare to think, he often utters in deeds. The heart is revealed to the deeds. Like, I could have just said that last little line there, but his intro to that is so powerful. And my apologies for the typos. Unfortunately, none of this is digital, so I have to transcribe every single piece of this for the class in order to get it here. So my apologies. But what is this saying, right? What is it that makes living worthwhile? And that's kind of what he says here. What way of living is compatible with grandeur and mystery of life? It is a life that is focused on our actions, on the things that we do. And he actually goes so far as to say, it's not about reflection. We can sit and, I mean, this is kind of your criticism of him, Diane, right? He's sitting in his ivory tower at the theological seminary, coming up with his philosophies, right? No, you have to go out and you have to live it. Now, he is going to argue this not just in terms of social action, but he's going to say, don't just think about Shabbat, live it. Don't just think about kashrut, live it. Don't just think about business ethics, live it, right? So he would argue this for every aspect of Judaism. Civil rights is just what we know him to do a lot, but he taught Judaism more than just that. And for him, the deed is what makes us who we are. It's what makes us alive. Michael.
Yeah, I guess I would argue that there's another interpretation of this paragraph, and that is that you're revealed through your deeds, but not necessarily because you've thought of something first. Many of us act without thought because it just feels like the right thing to do. And we're not in any way philosophizing or thinking about it. It's just, we do it because it feels good.
Right.
It has to be a good deed, or it could be something less altruistic.
So look, I don't want to put words into Heschel's mouth. He's not here to defend himself. But I would argue that he would probably say that, yes, but that's dangerous, right?
He does say that.
Yeah, he does.
He does say that, but not here.
To act without thinking, to act without the philosophy, without the reason why, doesn't do anything. It's one of the things, look, I mean, we talk about it all the time in Judaism vis-a-vis the concept of kavanah, right, of intention. And when I'm teaching my basic Judaism class and I'm trying to teach that concept, I say, what's the difference of lighting candles on a Wednesday afternoon or a Friday night? Nothing. The act is identical except the kavanah.
No, it's different,
right?
But,
so the intent shapes what it is that we do. So he would argue there has to be something behind it. It can't be divorced from it. But yes, he's definitely leaning more heavily on the side of the action than the philosophy or the thought.
I guess this is where if what you just said is, I didn't get that. He does say that there is a thought, there must be thought. And in fact, awe of God is also what he says before deed, in order to understand why you're doing it the right way you're doing it. But the fact of the matter is, people don't act that way.
Agreed. But, people don't do lots of things, right? I mean, I preach the importance of Shabbat. Not everybody in my congregation keeps Shabbat. People make their choices.
Let's think about the other way around. People do a lot of good deeds because inside somewhere they got the message that this is good for society, or it's good for me, and that makes them feel good by doing these good deeds. And I don't think it matters whether or not they've thought about it in a deep philosophical way.
So, yes, but I'll challenge you to say, right, you're precluding the argument that it feels good because it's been hardwired into us to feel good.
And that's where education comes in, isn't it?
Well, it's education, or maybe, right, it feels good because, right, people could argue that it's divine, right? That the divine conscience within us, right, could do that. You could argue that direction as well.
And I would agree with that. That's exactly what I think is happening.
Okay, good. Peter and then Nancy.
I just find that we have to take self out of it. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Explain.
To me, it's not about one's own needs. It's about the needs of a group. It's about community. I don't find that we can exist or do this in a vacuum. It has to be done as a group. And I asked before, is this really meant for a Jewish voice or a Jewish perspective to how we view the world? And is this how everyone else does? I always thought that if there was really one God, he wouldn't have made so many paths to find him. And I'm more and more confused as I get older and older, and don't understand other perspectives as much. I'm coming at this very much from a Jewish perspective.
So I'm going to hold the second half of your question because our next source actually is going to deal with what Heschel says about that. But the first part of the question, what I will say to you is, yes, Judaism is definitely about community. However, Heschel was speaking about a personal relationship with God. And Heschel always spoke about a personal relationship with God. So we are part of a community and we can't divorce ourselves from that. Try sometimes, right? But all of these philosophers, right? Heschel was focused on you, Peter, can have a personal relationship with God, and that's going to be individual, and that's something that you should seek and you should try to understand and you should promote, and that may be different than the way that I relate to God or whether somebody else relates to God, because every personal relationship is going to be different. And I think Heschel would definitely speak about the self as being important in that conversation, because otherwise you can't have a relationship. Nancy.
Unmute. Okay. So I think there are two things here that are, and you need them both. One is to take action and the other is significance. And if you have just one without the other, you're missing something. I mean, one example from like a totally other, well, not totally other, from another field is like people who take personal development classes, and they're kind of, junkies. They thrive on them, and they take a lot of classes, but they never actually apply what they learned in these classes to, in action, to actually make change in themselves, or, in case of personal development, it would be in yourself, but in this, but, Heschel's talking about man or person in the community. And
right.
Yeah, so that's my comment.
I like that. No, thank you, Nancy. I think that's astute. Okay, so let's actually kind of respond to Peter's question a little bit and see, what does Heschel say about other religions? And he actually wrote in a journal called the Union Seminary Quarterly Review, USQR. He wrote an article called "No Religion is an Island." And this excerpt comes from that. And he says, what divides us? We disagree in law and creed, in commitments which lie at the very heart of our religious existence. We say no to one another in some doctrines essential and sacred to us. What unites us? Our being accountable to God, our being objects of God's concern, precious in his eyes. Our conceptions of what ails us may be different, but the anxiety is the same. The language, the imagination, the concretization of our hopes are different, but the embarrassment is the same. And so is the sigh, the sorrow, and the necessity to obey. Continues. We may disagree about the ways of achieving fear and trembling, but the fear and trembling are the same. And so is arrogance, iniquity. The proclamations are different. The callousness is the same. Above all, while dogmas and forms of worship are divergent, God is the same. There are moments when we all stand together to see our faces in the mirror, the anguish of humanity and its helplessness, the perplexity of the individual and the need of divine guidance, being called to praise and to do what is required. So he tries to bring people together and acknowledges in the midst of this, we're going to disagree on a lot of different things. But there are certain things that we can and do agree on. And you've heard me say this before, my challenge that I've talked about oftentimes in today's world, especially the last decade, is not the fact that we hold different opinions, but that we can't hold different opinions and actually have a civil conversation, regardless of what the opinion is, right? Judaism is about disagreement, even within Judaism. Judaism is about disagreement. Look at the Talmud. We disagree with one another, all the time. And yet the majority and minority opinion are there in the Talmud. So he takes that idea and he broadens it out to a different audience. And in this audience, he's actually speaking not just to Jews, but to non-Jews as well. Saul said, it's interesting that the piece was in Union Seminary Quarterly and not a JTS journal. First of all, the JTS journal at that time was just horrible. They really didn't publish a lot of good stuff anyway, certainly not in terms of this type of thing. But I think Heschel is intending to get this message out to a different audience and not just a Jewish audience if you read through the whole thing. Okay, any comments on this before we move, I think, to what is our last source? All right. Okay, no, there's actually this source and two small ones. I like this source a lot. It's from God in Search of Man. A Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of thought. He is asked to surpass his needs, to do more than he understands in order to understand more than he does. Very Heschelian sentence. He is asked to do more than he understands in order to understand more than he does. Heschel loved writing that way. In carrying out the word of the Torah, he is ushered into the presence of spiritual meaning. Not in reading the Torah is he ushered into spiritual meaning. In carrying out the Torah is how he is ushered into spiritual meaning. Through the ecstasy of deeds, he learns to be certain of the here-ness of God. Right living is a way to right thinking. Now, that last piece is very, very classic Jewish, right? Judaism is about the action will give way to the philosophy, the thought afterwards. The Talmud asks this directly, right? Is it better to do the learning or to do the action, to understand or to do the action? It says, do the action even if you don't understand it, because by doing it, you'll come to understand it. So it's a very classic Jewish belief and Jewish understanding. But here we start to see, again, the philosophy that brought him out into the streets with Dr. King to act. It's not about just sitting and learning Torah. It's about putting that into practice. Two small little sources that we have to finalize. From God in Search of Man, God is hiding in the world. Our task is to let the divine emerge in our deeds. For those who took my basic Judaism class, we talk about philosophy, theology, and classic theologies of God. I bring a source that comes from the Talmud that says, the Talmud asks the question, there's a verse in Psalms that says, we need to follow the ways of God. The Talmud asks, how can a human being who's flesh and blood follow the ways of God? And the answer is, just as God clothes the naked, so too should we clothe the naked. Just as God buries the dead, so too should we bury the dead, right? And the implication of that is, by doing these actions, we bring God into this world. We are godly. God emerges in our deeds. And I think that's what Heschel is trying to say. And finally, for man is not alone. This is a famous quote, to stand for is to be, right? If you don't stand for something, then you are not. To stand for is to be. Any comments, questions? Saul.
You know, I don't want to belabor this, but and you would know better than most of us or all of us actually, but it seems like he must have been such a fish out of water at JTS because it seemed like such a rigorous academic, almost elitist, some brilliant minds there, some brilliant scholars. And what he's saying here basically is, you know, if you're not doing, if you're just talking about it or studying it, that's not, you're missing sort of the bigger picture. He must have really, there must have been like a real cultural clash when he was there.
Yes. I mean, look, the reality is, I think to some degree there was. Saul, you've sort of, you know, you've shared articles with me and I've seen them too, you know, some from his daughter, who say, there were some struggles there at JTS. At the same time, by the way, he could have taught at HUC, which was much more, the reform movement was much more interested in the action and making those sorts of statements, and those, especially the civil rights movement, right? The Religious Action Committee of the HUC actually was very involved in the civil rights movement in creating the legislation and stuff like that. He started there. He could have gone back and taught there, and chose to stay at JTS because he also came from University of Berlin. He did enjoy the academic rigor that was there. And so he was really a man, I think, living in two different worlds. And let me reframe this. If he wouldn't have had the academic rigor, JTS never would have kept him. Right? They would have said, go out. And we saw that, by the way. And Kaplan had some academic rigor, but not as much as Heschel did. And Kaplan really was sort of forced to leave JTS because they didn't like what he was saying. They didn't like where he was going, and with the way that he was framing Judaism, where he wanted the conservative movement to go. Nobody ever asked Heschel to leave. They may have said, oh, him again, right? They may have, but nobody asked him to leave in that sort of way. And so, and certainly the way they talk about him now, and it could be revisionist history, but the way they talk about it now isn't. Whereas the way they talk about Kaplan is different. To me, those are the two people who were living and teaching at JTS, who were a little bit, as you say, a fish out of water in terms of they weren't towing the line of the typical JTS teacher in terms of what it is that they taught. Okay, was there any other comments? Diana said, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. I like that. Peter said, Indiana Jones, a leap of faith. Yeah, to some degree. Some degree. And Michael said, it's consistent with your point, but I've said so many different things now, I'm not sure exactly what was consistent with your point. But thank you for saying that to me.
Yeah, it was 2 slides ago.
Okay. All right. So this gives us a little bit of an insight in terms of Heschel and how he sees human beings and our roles here. So let's summarize a little bit. We see in Heschel that there's a duality in the nature of human beings. He framed it as image and dust, as animal and spiritual, as divine and physical. There's a lot of different ways that we can frame it, but there is definitely this duality, and we have to find a place to live within those two poles. And as you said, we have to do it simultaneously. He also argues, right, that inaction or indecision allows for evil to flourish and God ultimately to disappear. And we didn't see that directly, but I'm bringing this in because this is a part of his philosophy. When we don't take action, when we don't do these deeds, it opens up the possibility for evil to come in. Let me finish my summary, Michael, and then I'll get to it.
Sure, yeah.
Heschel echoes the traditional Jewish belief that actions are far more important and meaningful than just thoughts by themselves. It's what we do, not what we believe, that makes us Jews. And this is really in contradistinction to other religions that are about belief, not necessarily action. That's the defining factor, right? If we talk about especially evangelical Christianity,
yeah,
right? It's just about the belief.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what's going to make it or break it. And from Heschel, and frankly from a Jewish perspective, that's not the case. Okay, so finally some questions, Michael, and then Diana, or comments.
Yeah, I want to go back to the duality of image and dust. To me, when we talk about it, dust is something that I believe, or at least for me, refers to our mortality and our limited capabilities for both thought and action. Image, for me, refers to the immortality of God. We are created in God's image. God is infinite, immortal, and a real superhero. What I believe is sort of hidden in between these two is what we can do in our mortal life to mimic what God would mimic God's actions if he were immortal.
So I like what you're saying, Michael. It's an interesting way to read it. I read it a little bit differently, right? I see, right, in the creation of human beings, image is the non-physical. An image is not physical. It has no substance. It's just an image.
Yeah.
Whereas the dust is the physical. And so it's the coming together of the two components, the physical and the non-physical. Diana correctly, said when we were talking about it back then, it's a very Hasidic sort of understanding of the animal soul and the spiritual soul, the physical side of us and the non-physical side of us, that I think he's trying to reframe into words that would play better in a more secular audience than the way that the Hasidic rabbis, talk about it. But that's really what he's trying to bring.
Okay, thank you.
Diana.
So I'm left a little bit confused now, especially by that last bullet point there, and maybe this will become more clear next week. But what I was hearing from last week's class and a lot of this is that things are happening simultaneously. They're fused together. We had all those beautiful images and metaphors of the violin and the melody and all of that. And now he's saying at the very end, it is what we do, not what we believe, that makes us Jews. Whereas I've always been taught that the outer garments are composed of thought, speech, and action. Arguably, that's what he was brought up to learn as well, that thought, speech, and action. And now, in the end, the punchline is, it's just what we do, not what we believe. But how can we be Jews if our beliefs and that covenant that we talked about an hour ago are what makes us Jews?
So I would argue, Diana, that he doesn't divorce himself from belief, right? Yeah. He's a philosopher. It's all about the belief. That being said, right, a melody goes nowhere if it's not shared in some way. If you don't sing it, if you don't write it down, if you don't play it or whatever. And so the philosophy may be of this beautiful philosophy, but it's going to go nowhere. It's going to have no impact on this world unless we can play that melody.
I'm wondering if he just forgot one word, though, instead of to say it is not only what we do, or it is what we do, not only what we believe, that makes us Jews.
Maybe.
Where I feel like there is just in that a separation, but I understand what you're saying, so thank you.
Yeah. He doesn't say that. I hear that you would like him to. I think he would argue, he argues a line of thought almost kind of very Talmudically, right? When you study Talmud, you learn that you take an argument to its end, even though a page beforehand, they said something totally opposite. You still take that argument to its end. And so he's okay doing that. He's okay saying this is important. Now, it's not the only thing that's important, but I think what he's going to say is it makes us uniquely Jewish. Because a Christian will say, I believe. I don't have to do. But if you say as a Jew, I believe, it's not enough. You have to do also. I think that's what his argument is. Elisheva. Sorry.
I have two questions, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
So when you were reading that God wants us to do, right? So the world trivialities hit me because I was not expecting that word. I was expecting persecutions, because actually what we do, what we want to teach, what we want to practice, has made us different from everybody else. And then we have this commitment that we have to teach the world to be better, that we have to spread the word, right? So
Yeah,
what-
but I think what he was saying back then is, don't spend your time on Narishkeit, right? On these things that don't really make a difference. We spend so much of our time on stuff that, we read Cosmo and we do all this sort of stuff to, like, does it really matter? But there are things in this world that really does matter. And that's what we should be spending our time. So to me, that's what the trivialities was about. It's this stuff that just doesn't matter. Don't spend your time on that.
okay.
And
The
you
second
had another question.
Yeah. So I think it was in the first slide, it said like, let's stop sacrificing ourselves. Is that related to Kiddush Hashem? And are you going to talk about it? Does he have any position? Or what are the position of rabbis nowadays about that?
No,
Is
so
that-
it was, no, so that's not what, I understand what you're asking. It's actually not what he was saying. He was saying, should we sacrifice all the things we want to do for this religion that it doesn't make, is it really part of our lives anymore?
Oh,
Right? So it wasn't we sacrifice ourselves for Judaism, but it's we sacrifice the things that we want to do, right? Bacon cheeseburger is really delicious. Am I gonna not eat that? Right? Am I gonna sacrifice that because I believe I should not do that?
oh.
Right? Being able to go out and to do things on Shabbat, that's nice, but I don't do that because I don't drive, right? Those sorts of things, those are sacrifices we make to be Jewish, to be different. Right? We make sacrifices, sometimes in business, sometimes in other things. So I think that's what he was saying.
Thank you.
And Hillary asks, doesn't the first slide give a hint of his view of the Holocaust? Yes, I would agree that it does. That he has to, at some point in time, have the voice of the Holocaust. It has to jibe somehow with the voice from Sinai. It has to be there. So I agree with that. Rivka, I'll give you the last question.
Well, actually, I was just going to explain my horribly written thought in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
I was thinking the dust and image and how we find our place between the two, and still, and I guess I was trying to encompass all that I heard from Heschel tonight. And it is because we reflect the image of God, or because that is part of who we are, that image, we are capable of making changes that will redeem or elevate the world. And by being dust, we're here in the physical, we are in a position to actually do those things, so that even though we are finite beings, what we do in redeeming or elevating the world lasts longer than we do.
Right, and I'll take what you say to a different level and say, I think Heschel would probably argue that, the angels don't have the ability to change this world, right? And that that we do, right? The angels don't have the ability to be in a relationship with God through Torah. We do. That's a gift to us as human beings. Okay. So next week, what we're going to do actually is we're going to talk specifically about Shabbat. And we're going to delve a little bit deeper into some of the text. So what I've done for these last 2 weeks is really kind of give you a snippet here, there, of different things. But really next week, we're going to look at almost entirely his work, the Sabbath, and focus in a little bit more on that and on that concept, and try to understand how he views the Sabbath and what the Sabbath can do for us as Jews. He didn't write about any other mitzvah specifically, right? I mean, he wrote about him by alagav, we say in Hebrew, but sort of by way of going there in some of his books. But the Sabbath is the only book that is dedicated to a specific mitzvah, a specific Jewish idea. And there's a reason for that. And for him, he sees, I would venture to say, he sees the Sabbath as one of the most foundational and formational mitzvot that we have that makes us Jews and lets us do what we need to do in this world. And that's what we're going to try to understand as we go. Any last questions? All right, everyone, have a great week.
Thank you so much for this class.
You're welcome.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Loving
Thank
it.
you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Welcome, David Ramsden. Glad you could join us.
Come join us on Shabbat morning under the tent, guys. It's great. Register
I
online.
signed up. I get to come. I'm
Good.
excited.
It's
And we're hoping to
beautiful.
hear, look, we're going to hear tomorrow from the county. We're hoping to hear that we can get to a point where we can actually move back inside.
Ah,
Oh, wow.
I'm hoping to get there.
You
yeah.
know me, I'm happy in the
But
tent.
it's
I'm
nice
happy.
outside.
It is nice
Actually.
outside. Like now it is.
Finally.
There were a few days in the winter time that it was pretty cold
Cool.
in the morning at 8:30, and there were a few days last summer that it got pretty hot. So I miss being in our sanctuary, and it's time we move back inside. So we're
You
we're
didn't
working
get
towards
down to -12, so don't
No.
cry.
that. Hey,
That's
I
why
had to
we
wear,
live here,
I couldn't
Peter.
wear short sleeves. That's cold.
Uh-huh.
All right, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Here.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.